Welcome to the third Peace and Unification lecture series today. We've got our wonderful speaker, Dr. James Hoare, talking about North Korea, threat, unification, and other themes. Korean translation will be available by clicking the button down somewhere there. If somebody can explain it via the chat box, that would be lovely. Let me go to the next page. Once you enter this room, we would recommend you change your name and your organization shown. And please turn off your microphone during the lecture. However, please leave your questions in the chat box in English or in Korean. We will try to address as many questions as possible during the question and answer session. Bear in mind that the seminar is recorded and will be available online via YouTube. Please keep your camera off if you wish not to appear in the recordings. We will start with the opening and welcome speech, followed by the instruction of today's speaker, Dr. James Hoare, and then we will move on to the lecture with Q&As and feedback at the end.
Can I? Dr. Mia Kim? Can I start?
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Mia Kim. Hello, everybody. I'm Do-sun Chang, Chairman of the Peaceful Unification Advisory Council of Korea in the United Kingdom. I would like to welcome all of you attending today's lecture and sincerely thanks Dr. James Hoare for giving us an insightful lecture today. We, the Peaceful Unification Advisory Council, is a non-governmental organization which aims to advise the President of the Republic of Korea on the topic of peaceful unification. As all of you already know, the reunification of the South and North Korea, the only divided nation in the world, is an issue of paramount significance that requires us to overcome numerous barriers and difficulties. In light of current global tensions caused by the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine, and geopolitical threats surrounding the Korean Peninsula, it will likely take us a considerable amount of time and effort to achieve peaceful unification. Although it is difficult right now to imagine unification being achieved in a short period of time, we still hope that the unification of the Korean Peninsula will bring a better future for the whole world and our next generation. As such, global attention and efforts are needed for the peaceful unification of the Korean Peninsula. Today, we have invited the best instructor to provide us with guidance on this important topic. Today's lecturer, Dr. James Hoare, was a leading participant in the establishment of a British embassy in North Korea, and he has extensive experience and in-depth knowledge of the historical dynamics of the Korean Peninsula. So I am very excited to hear Dr. Hoare's thoughts regarding how we should understand and approach the subject of the unification on the Korean Peninsula. After the lecture, we'll also invite everyone in the audience to ask any questions you may have for Dr. Hoare. Through today's lecture and discussions, we are looking to build an invaluable foundation upon which we will formulate our guidance for the government of the Republic of Korea. If we continue to focus our attention and efforts on this topic as we are doing today, and we are able to carry this experience forward, towards the unified Korean peninsula, I dare say the world could say the reunification of Korea come true sooner than we expected today. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Sung-Suk Choi, could you introduce today's speaker, please?
Thank you, Dr. Kim. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to introduce
Sorry. My wife will have picked it up.
Thank you. This is my great pleasure and honor to introduce Dr. James Hoare, a diplomat and Oriental historian, who, as a British East-Asian affair, laid the foundations for the establishment of a full British embassy in the North Korean capital, Pyongyang, after Britain and the North Korea re-established diplomatic relations in 2000. From 1969 to 2003, he was a member of the British Foreign and Commonwealth Research Analyst, working mainly on China, Japan, and Korean Peninsula. He held a post in Seoul and Beijing in the 80s. He's also a prolific writer and an academic. After retiring from Her Majesty's Diplomatic Service in 2003, he returned to academia and taught Korean history for several years at Seoul, the School of Oriental and African Studies, where he received his PhD. He's currently SOAS research associate and continues to advise PhD students and examine PhD theses as an external examiner in higher education in the UK, the most recent one being Sheffield University, of course, in examining PhD thesis in SOAS as well. He's also an associate fellow in Asia program at Chatham House, the Royal Institute of International Affairs, since 2014, and actively engaging in numerous broadcasting events as commentator on radio and television in the UK and abroad on all aspects of East Asian or Korean issues. Of course, he enjoys writing and he has a passion for writing and sharing his knowledge in diplomatic affairs in East Asia, and has written widely on all aspects of East Asia. He has written several books together with Susan Perez, his wife. Just to give you a few examples of his written work, his books on conflict in Korea, a political and economic dictionary of East Asia, North Korea in the 21st century. Books on his own include Embassies in the East, Historical Dictionary of the Republic of Korea, new and expanded edition in 2020 as well. So most recently, he's edited collections on critical readings on North and South Korea, and revised and expanded editions of an historical dictionary of the People's Democratic Republic of Korea. He's the current editor of the World Today series, East and South East Asia. He's still in touch with the North Korean embassy in the UK and recently visited North Korea in 2018 for a conference. He continues to share his rich diplomatic experience and wealth of knowledge on all aspects of East Asia to help understand North and South Korea in British society. So again, it is my great privilege and an honor to introduce Dr. James Hoare for today's event, and very much look forward to learning and discussing the current themes around North Korea. Welcome and thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you both, Mr. Jang Do-sun, the Chairman of the Peaceful Unification Advisory Council of Korea in the United Kingdom, and Choi Sung-Suk, Dr. Sung-Suk Choi. We will move on to the lecture. And here are the 4 topics we are going to discuss with Dr. Jim Hoare today. Jim, I want to propose that you spend about 10 minutes each topic, and after that I will invite audience participants from the chat box. So if participants, if you can leave your comments and questions during the lecture, so after Jim's addressing the topic, we will invite you to, and then you can turn on your audio and then read your questions. But if you prefer me to read it out, I will do it for you. Then Jim, are we ready to start?
Ready?
Okay, the very first one, your experiences as a diplomat in North Korea. Do you mind sharing your experiences a little bit with us, please?
I will try. Let me first of all apologize. I've never actually managed to master the PowerPoint system, so I can't show you pictures. But one of the strange things about being in North Korea when I was there was that there appeared to be no restrictions on what pictures one took. I only had problems on 2 occasions. One, when I was trying to photograph a sculpture on a building in the middle of the city, and a guard came out and wanted me to go away, and I wouldn't go away, and eventually his boss came and said, "Oh, it's all right, you can photograph that." And it turned out I was resting myself against the cabinet office to take this thing, so it was a very sensitive point. But generally I was allowed to take pictures, and I have thousands of them. Some interesting, some far less interesting. But as was said, I went to North Korea, to the DPRK, in 2001, after Britain established diplomatic relations. At first, we did not intend to have an embassy in Pyongyang. I was going to be part of the embassy in Seoul, but would be side accredited. That meant I would be able to operate in North Korea. But the head of the Foreign Office, the senior civil servant, decided to visit Pyongyang in April 2001 and said this was a silly arrangement and it would be much better if I was based in Pyongyang. And so from May 2001, I moved to Pyongyang. Eventually, my wife joined me, and we lived for 6 months in hotels, and then we had an apartment. But while an ambassador's residence was being constructed, we spent 2 weeks in the ambassador's residence right at the end of our time there. 2001 was very different from today. There was a certain degree of hope about North Korea-South Korea relations following the meeting between Kim Dae-jung and Kim Jong-il. The North Koreans were very pleased that many countries had established diplomatic relations, but they were particularly pleased that some countries had actually decided to open embassies in Pyongyang. We were one, the Germans were another. The only other Western European countries there then was Sweden. There were, of course, other European countries, Romania, Bulgaria. But we were a very small diplomatic community, and we worked very well together. If you read older accounts by diplomats, Western diplomats, of living and working in Pyongyang in the 1970s, the Australians and the Swedes, you have a world which is very much divided. The communist countries wouldn't talk to the non-communist countries, and most of the African and Asian countries were not very friendly towards such a small number of Western diplomats. By 2001, all that had changed, and we became very friendly with the Chinese ambassador, with the Russian ambassador and his wife. Unfortunate Ambassador Karlov, who was shot dead later in Turkey. But he was very helpful and very friendly. We also got on very well with the African and Asian countries that were there. One particular interesting thing was that the Commonwealth countries, those had been part of the British Empire, India, Pakistan, Egypt, so they were all very friendly. And on one occasion, I remember sitting with the ambassadors from these countries. Well, they all went on about how good things had been when the British were there. The trains ran on time, the water was clean and things like that, which was a bit of a surprise to me. But there we are. The North Koreans were also helpful insofar as they could be. There were limits on what they would do and what they wouldn't do. We had an enormous row with them that lasted 12 months over our communications system. We had understood from the agreement we first of all signed that we would be able to have communications, secure communications, internet-based communications. When we got there, they said, no, our laws don't allow it. And there followed, as I say, a year's arguments backwards and forwards about us getting permission to use the internet. Eventually, they allowed it, and not just for us, but for everybody else as well. And it was interesting because they had refused, for example, the World Food Programme, which was very important in North Korea at the time because this was the last stage of the famine years. And the World Food Programme staff were traveling all over the country and often living in very remote areas, but they couldn't communicate directly with their headquarters or even with their staff, with their colleagues in Pyongyang. So that was a victory. And it was in fact one of the things that surprised me because first of all, they'd said no, which is what everybody had said would happen. You won't be able to do that. And eventually, by persistence, we got there. And they never tried to take it away afterwards. There were other little things as well that were positive. I mean, they were helpful over getting us office accommodation. And in the end, we decided not to use what they were offering, but joined with the Swedes and the Germans in the old East German embassy, which was the old communist embassies, were huge, far bigger than anybody needed by 2001. What did we do? Well, it was not quite like being in a Western European country or being in Seoul or Tokyo. It was very hard work getting information. There wasn't a great deal of business. There was some. People were traveling, North Koreans were traveling to Europe and to Britain. We had an educational program operating. We had 3 teachers working in universities, but teaching the teachers in the universities about English language teaching. And this was a very popular program. And eventually it extended to 4 teachers, and later it was 5. Unfortunately, in the last 5 or 6 years, all that stopped because of the questions over North Korea's nuclear program. It was interesting also who came and visited North Korea. If you stood at the airport and just watched, you had some big surprises. One day I found myself standing by a very tall and upright ex-soldier, quite clearly, short haircut, European looking. And I got into conversation with him, and it turned out he was a former US Marine colonel. Now, Americans didn't go to North Korea. Oh, yes, they did. He was organizing a tour of veterans from the Korean War who were being allowed to visit, which is, again, something that really surprised me. Then there were more traditional groups, friendship groups, pro-North Korean groups, if you like, who generally wouldn't talk to us. But it was interesting to see what they did and how they were treated. They were given great respect, great honor, but never shown anything very much. The other thing that I think surprised me was how much traveling I could do. We could go anywhere in the Pyongyang area and in the greater Pyongyang area, which is much larger than just the city. We could also go to Nampo and around Nampo, unless you went near the docks, which you needed permission to go to the docks. But otherwise, you could visit the area. You could visit the seaside there. But in terms of knowledge and work, it was being able to go out into the countryside and to travel around with the UN agencies, the World Food Programme, and all the other groups that operated there, and with any British or European NGOs that operated in North Korea. So instead of being stuck in Pyongyang, which I think had been the experience of most diplomats in the earlier period, back in the 1970s, I found that from, say, February till November, I was traveling at least once a week out of Pyongyang, sometimes staying away overnight, going to places that were still officially unopened to foreigners. At that point, Hamhung and Wonsan were not open to foreigners, but I'd been to both of them several times. And the range of things we visited was quite interesting as well. Factories, yes, but also you saw the terrible economic devastation of the 1990s. If you drove along the coast from Wonsan up towards Hamhung, you passed mile after mile of derelict factories. And it was obvious they were derelict. There were trees growing out of the buildings and things like that. I think I only went to one functioning factory on the first trip I did from Wonsan to Hamhung. All the rest were just shuttered up, not working. But we were still allowed to go and see the area. We went to schools, we went to orphanages, of which there were a lot operating because of the consequences of the famine years. And we went to hospitals. I never want to go to another North Korean hospital, I tell you. They were in a terrible state at that time. I think there's been an improvement since then, but the country had stopped really giving much attention to healthcare. As economic difficulties started in the 1980s and then increased in the 1990s, health was not a priority, or so it seemed. Doctors tried their best. I think subsequently many doctors have become almost quasi-capitalists and they charge you now. Well, in those days, they were still following a socialist ethic and they didn't charge, but they didn't have anything much to help people with. The consequences of the economic downturn was that there were no drugs being produced in the country, not legal drugs anyway. We all heard about illegal drugs, but even aspirin was no longer being produced. And so if you got ill, well, you either recovered or you died. Nobody could cure you. And the conditions in the hospitals were very, very primitive indeed. Because of shortages of fuel in the winter, they would close as many hospitals as they could and concentrate any patients that they had on one hospital because they could heat one hospital. But of course, everything suffered from the economic consequences of the bad years. There was very little fuel, so there was very little electricity. Even in Pyongyang, electricity was often quite. We were okay. We had a generator which would kick in if the town electricity stopped. But whole parts of Pyongyang were, and I believe still are, dark at night. They rotate which areas are dark. There was no shortage of food as far as we were concerned. And indeed, the famine years were, as I say, had come to an end. Things were improving. There was food available, not just in Pyongyang, but outside Pyongyang as well. Although we were never allowed into markets, we could go into shops in places. Now you can go into markets, but at that point you couldn't.
It is fascinating to hear your personal accounts as a diplomat in North Korea.
But
what about
we?
Yes. I think it might be better if we move on to the next question, which is North Korea today.
Would you want to take questions on this part first, if anybody has any questions?
Sounds good to me. Give me 1 second, please. Dr. Shin, would you like to, please? Yes.
I have one question. So you said there were diplomats from other countries, and I'm wondering whether they were happy to be located in North Korea, and also, do you think if they would have chosen to be located in North Korea if that was optional? And also wondering if there has been other diplomats who were in the North Korean embassy in UK embassy in Pyongyang. And were they actually, do they voluntarily go, or if they are told to go, are they not happy?
Well, it varies from diplomatic service to diplomatic service. When I first joined the Foreign Office, you were told where to go. So I was told I was going to Seoul. The ambassador had to agree. Then I was told I was going to Beijing. The ambassador had to agree. But by the time I went to Beijing, I mean, they would consult you about whether you wished to go. And if you said no, that was all right. And in fact, all people in all our embassies now are volunteers. They've asked for that job, which sometimes causes a bit of problems because people don't want to go to certain places. But I was very lucky. I mean, for a long time, there were just two of us in the embassy. My wife was there, but she wasn't working in the embassy. She did actually work for UNICEF, but all of those who came, I think, were quite pleased to be there in our embassy. In other embassies, it was different. They were just told you're going to this place and that place. And in some cases, people stayed for an awful long time because their country couldn't afford to move them back. Or most people that I used to speak to seemed to actually quite enjoy life there. It wasn't Paris or Tokyo or New York or Washington, but it had its pleasures. And I don't remember anybody really complaining much, except one or two younger people who found it all a bit dull. There was a diplomatic club called the RAC, which doesn't stand for the Royal Automobile Club, which it does in Britain. It stands for the Random Access Club, because all the NGOs wanted random access to check what was happening with the food that was being distributed and things like that. So it wasn't an unhappy diplomatic corps. It was quite small. We were at the most a couple of hundred. We, as I say, we all mixed. There were some strange people. The Cambodian ambassador, his wife said he does nothing but he meditates. He was in his 80s, so he was very old. Not surprised he didn't do much. But some of them were very active, some weren't. Some had a different purpose altogether. The Indian and the Pakistan ambassadors both said, we're here to watch what the other side is doing, what the Indians or the Pakistanis are doing. But it wasn't an unhappy place then. I think subsequently, and certainly in the last few years, as the government got more restrictive and then COVID struck, it became very, very difficult. And in the end, I think certainly all the big embassies closed. Some of those that couldn't move their staff are still there, I think. But all the Europeans have now left. They haven't closed the embassies, but there are no European staff there. And one day they hope to go back, but when that will be, I don't know.
Speaking of which, I got a question from someone else asking, seems like the UK started its embassy in North Korea quite at the early stage. Do you know if there was a specific reason or purpose why the UK wanted to open an embassy in North Korea? And then after this question, could Han Chung-il, Mr. Han, would you mind reading your question after this, after addressing this question, please? And mic is back to Jim. Yes, you.
Sorry, what was the question?
Yeah, so the question was, it seems like the UK opened its embassy quite early.
Yeah. Well, we opened our embassy, as most countries did, or established diplomatic relations, because the South Korean government at that point, I remember Kim Dae-jung was the president, wanted us to do so. Whereas earlier on, South Korean governments had all said, no, don't have anything to do with North Korea. And there were only a very small number of countries that did establish relations. Sweden did, and Finland, and I think Norway, but they didn't have, only the Swedes had permanent residence there, and the others didn't. And that was to do with North Korean debt to them dating from the 1970s, and they hoped to get it back. They never did. We had a very hands-off attitude towards North Korea. We didn't actually recognize it as a state until it entered the United Nations. And even then, we were not very friendly towards it. They would send a delegation to London each year, and they were met, but they weren't treated in a very friendly manner. But the South Korean president was very keen, and ministers made a decision very suddenly when Mr. Blair, who was then the Prime Minister, and Robin Cook, who was the Foreign Secretary, were going to Seoul for the Asia-Europe meeting in 2000. They said to the British ambassador in Seoul, what would the South Koreans want us to do above all? And the answer was, they want you to establish relations with North Korea. So that's how it came about. It wasn't because of the North Koreans' blue eyes. But,
it wasn't just the UK government's decision to open the embassy in the North Korea, but there was a gesture from South Korean regime back then.
It was solidarity with a country with which we were very friendly.
Thank you. Mr. Han, would you like to read your question, please?
I'll keep it very brief because I think Dr. Hoare just replied to my...
제가 직접 말해도 될까요?
한정로 선생님, yes, after the 한충일 선생님's question, would you mind reading your question?
아니, 어쨌든 저희 생각은 이렇습니다. 저는 민간인들을 주로 방문을 했기 때문에 공간 이런 것보다도 그때 제가 진짜 2004년에 정말 느낀 거는 먹고
So Han from Germany was sharing her experience of visiting the North Korea back then, having a conversation with the public over there. Thank you for sharing your story, but I want to read the questions like from the top. So we will go back to the Han Chung-il, Mr. Han Chung-il, please.
Yes, sorry. I think we shared the same family name, so maybe that's the confusion.
My apologies. Sorry. Yes.
So, and thank you, Dr. Hoare. It's really fascinating to hear your first-handed account. I'm currently working on my PhD thesis on North Korea's strategic thinking about unification. And interestingly, in 1970s and 80s, there was an ongoing diplomatic battle between North Korea and South Korea, where South Korea would engage in lobbying efforts to those countries that recognize North Korea to not recognize it as a government. At the same time, North Korean government was unhappy with those countries that also recognized South Korea as a legitimate government. So I think there is an element of legitimacy in establishing the diplomatic relations between two countries. So my question was about, when UK decided to establish its embassy in North Korea, even though it didn't really recognize North Korea as a state, weren't there any elements of, recognizing North Korea as an international player, or to engage with North Korea with more on equal terms? Because inevitably, if you have an embassy, that means you will start the ongoing relations with that country in a more formal ways. So I don't know if there were any backlash or dissents toward that view. Yeah.
Well, sorry, we did not recognize North Korea until 1992. So by the time we established the embassy, we'd recognized it as a state for 8 years. Only states can join the United Nations. So once we'd accepted that North Korea was in the United Nations, then we recognized it as a state. And so there was no problem. We could have an embassy or we could not have an embassy. It was up to us. Well, we could have had the ambassador in Beijing or the ambassador in Seoul as the ambassador to Pyongyang. But we chose, for the reasons I said, that to have somebody there, because you would learn more by being there than by not being there. I think, just to digress a little bit, one of the great mistakes that the United States has made is not to actually have gone ahead with the decision back in the 1990s to establish a liaison office in Beijing. They established a liaison office in Beijing first back in 1972. But to establish an office in Pyongyang, they would have learned so much more about North Korea. Even though the North Koreans may not tell you much, you do learn by being there. It is different from being in Washington and trying to analyze North Korea. It's different from being in London. You see things and you learn things that you just can't otherwise. The United States has several ambassadors for North Korea, doesn't have an ambassador to North Korea. Now, I don't think embassies are magic solutions to international problems, but they can help. The fact that you have staff there, people there, that you get to know people, you get to know things, you see things differently just by being there. Now, you may not always agree with what you see. Some of my successors were not very, and I can give you some names if you want one of them at least to talk to you, because it would be useful for you to have a different perspective on all this. They didn't like what they saw in North Korea. I mean, there are lots of things about North Korea I didn't like and still don't like and couldn't possibly like. But on the other hand, you do realize after a bit that these are real people. These are human beings. They have the same concerns and worries that you and I have. They're worried about their children. They're worried about their jobs, all things like that. So I always thought we should establish relations with North Korea. I suggested this when I was in Beijing. Of course, an immense exchange of correspondence. That the short answer was no to that particular proposal. But I think we have gained, and I think the North Koreans have gained from having embassies in each other's countries. But it's not a magic solution to things. Sorry, we're spending rather a lot of time on this.
But this was an important issue to discuss as well. Kathy Kang from 중동부 유럽협의회, would you like to raise your question?
Yes, hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, unfortunately I'm outside, but yeah. So my question is rather more personal. So because last year there was this Korean movie called Mogadishu, where South and North Korean diplomats face dangers of the civil war together in Mogadishu. So my question is, like, I wonder, you as a diplomat, like, did you face any dangers while you were in North Korea? And if so, like, how were you able to like overcome them? Or yes, so that's my question.
When I first went to North Korea in 1978, I went with I went as the political advisor to an EU delegation in 1978, a humanitarian delegation. I was a bit apprehensive, I was very pleased to be going, but I was a bit nervous. Would they try and subvert me? Would they, or something? Well, in fact, no. It was a very interesting, with occasional difficult moments. But I never felt under threat in North Korea in any way. I'm sure that our telephones were tapped. I'm sure that when we were in the hotel, people would come in and probably try and get into our computers. But that had been true in China as well. And when we were in South Korea, it was very, I'm sure that when we went traveling, it was known where we were in South Korea. I'll tell you a little story. I got a phone, we had a police liaison officer in Seoul. We'd been a sky marshal on Korean Air. Anyway, I got a phone call from him one afternoon saying, we have a report that a man has had problems with his car right down in the south. He says he's the British ambassador. Is he the British ambassador? And I said, yes, it was the British ambassador. He was driving his own car, a small car, and he'd managed to fill it up with diesel instead of petrol. It wouldn't go. Anyway, but though they kept an eye on us, don't worry. We were, where I lived in Seoul, in Dongbingo-dong, at that point, just across the road, was the head of what was then called the Engibu, now the National Intelligence Service. And I'm pretty sure that our maid told his staff every time we went out. And certainly the defense attaché was followed. He knew that. And we were followed in China as well. We were clearly followed in North Korea. I could drive anywhere I liked in Pyongyang and the greater Pyongyang area, as I said. And wherever we turned up, no notification, we hadn't said we were going any particular place, always somebody would appear and not come close to us, but just observe what we were doing. So we were being watched all the time. You got used to it. People said, oh, there'd be two-way mirrors in the hotels. Well, I said, I don't care, they can see me as they wish. So, I don't think there were two-way mirrors in the hotel. But at that point, we were in the Korea Hotel. At that point, there were no keys for the doors in the Korea Hotel. there are now. So staff would come and go as they wished, I think, and they probably did.
Shall we move on to the next question, because we are a little bit behind.
We're running late.
Which is North Korea today, and if possible, I think we can combine the second and third topics. Second was the North Korea today, and third is how much of a threat? How much of a threat in North Korea?
Well, let's just talk about
North Korea today.
The domestic situation, as far as I can see it. I mean, I think having for so long pretended that they did not have COVID, which I don't think was correct. I think they did have it. With close links with China, with the border with China, it's very hard to think that somebody did not bring it back in from China. So I think they've had COVID, but they pretended they didn't. Now they've admitted it, but I don't think the figures are probably very accurate. And certainly, even if they've got a less virulent strain of the virus, the Omicron, rather than one of the earlier ones, which were worse, I suspect the number of deaths they have is far greater than they're admitting. I think they were pretending that it wasn't there because they didn't want to reveal the inadequacies of the system, the inadequacies of their means of covering it. I don't understand why they didn't accept vaccines, except that they may have thought they would come with conditions that they weren't prepared to accept. You know, monitoring. They always disliked monitoring of food distribution and things like that. Wasn't how you should treat a sovereign state. But we only, I think, once ever got anything like spontaneous access to a building, and that was in Hamhon. Otherwise, you were always accompanied by people who set out the itinerary beforehand. So I don't think they were prepared to let people come in and monitor vaccination programs. It's a pity, because the one thing that they are very good at is if they decide that people are going to be vaccinated, they vaccinate everybody. I went out on at least one visit for vaccination. I have a picture of me frightening children, giving them vaccines. But they're very, very thorough. And partly because of the problems there are with the inadequacies of the health service, they try and use prevention rather than cure. So I think domestically that will have hit them. Domestically, they've also, I'm sure, been hit by the international sanctions that have been imposed on them. The sanctions have interfered with trade, obviously, but also effectively killed much of the humanitarian assistance that was going to North Korea. And although they used to say they didn't need it any longer, I think they still did need it. It's not that people are starving as they were in the 1990s, but they don't eat very well. They don't necessarily get anything like a balanced diet. Food distribution had improved even when I was there. And when I went back on other occasions, you could see that the market system was working differently. You would see farmers lined up by the side of the road with sacks of grain to take to market, waiting for a lorry to come along so they could hitch a lift into market. And not just in Pyongyang, but in the other big cities, you could see that shops were actually quite well stocked now, and they really were shops functioning as shops rather than the some of the shops when I was there were just for show. The big department, the #1 department store in the center of the city, never sold anything because it was the one place that the great leader or would visit. And how would you explain there was a tin missing from the display because you'd sold it? So they didn't sell things. If you went in and tried to buy something, they turned you out straight away. But things had got much better. And even despite the overemphasis on military and the overemphasis on the nuclear program, I think life had improved for ordinary people. When we were there, you started seeing women expecting babies again. And the UN agency said for 2 or 3 years, you did not see hardly any pregnant women, because unless you are reasonably fit and healthy, you don't menstruate, therefore you won't have a child. And gradually, pregnant women began to appear on the streets, and more babies started appearing. And every time I've been back, now the last time I wasn't outside Pyongyang, but other times I've been back, I was outside Pyongyang. And some of those better conditions were present in the countryside as well. But I think the concentration on the nuclear program and the consequent sanctions have damaged North Korea very badly. Now let's move on to the threat. There's a lot of hyperbole, exaggeration, I think, about exactly how much of a real threat North Korea is. I'm not saying it's not a possible threat to South Korea or even Japan or even to the US forces in those two countries. But the idea that somehow in a short span that they've been operating in the nuclear program, and it really, I know it gets longer and longer, but it's really only been going since, in its present form, since the late 1980s. Their first test of an atomic device is in 2006. The idea that they can strike accurately the United States is, I think, a myth. And unfortunately, though, that is how the US bases its policies towards North Korea. Do the North Koreans still intend to take South Korea by force? Well, the rhetoric might imply such, but I've never actually seen or heard anybody say that they would. They talk about peaceful unification. They don't. I never heard anybody talk about military unification. Military, if they were attacked, yes, but never about them attacking the South. They're not unfamiliar with the outside world. They know that South Korea is not the South Korea of 1950. They know that South Korea of 1950's military ability was extremely limited. It's not limited now. They know also that it has alliances with the United States. The circumstances are very different from 1950. And I think basically, at the end, they're not suicidal. They're not going to just go into conflict for the sake of going into a conflict. And I think, oddly enough, I've always drawn my greatest reassurance from the armistice agreement. Now, the armistice agreement is still in place. It's strained at times. It's been sorely tested. In the 1960s, the two sides were fighting artillery duels across the demilitarized zone. When I was in South Korea, there were, it wasn't so very long since the attempt had been made to attack the Blue House. There were miniature submarines landing on South Korean territory. But despite all these things, despite the incidents that did take place, despite even the blowing up of Chen Tuan's entourage in Rangoon, each side has known that the dangers of war are so great that you must try and avoid it. So both North and South have stuck to the armistice agreement, not always precisely to the letter, but basically to the agreement as a means of stopping the conflict. And it's worked. It's sometimes, as I say, been put under great strain, but it's worked. So I think the other factor is the role of China. China was reluctant to enter the Korean War. It did so because North Korea seemed to be losing. It did so because Stalin put pressure on them to do so. Wouldn't do it, would get involved himself if he could avoid it. But China did not want that war, and it certainly doesn't want another war. China is, again, very different from what it was back in 1950. But what it doesn't want is the power of the United States extended even further up the Korean Peninsula than it is at present. So any suggestions of a unification by force, I think, is not going to happen. I think for a time, it was thought that South Korea might come away from its close dependence on the United States, and therefore the two Koreas could sort things out for themselves. I don't think that they either of them see that particularly at the moment. But for a time, there seemed to be a certain optimism about we Koreans can solve things. I think it's been a great pity that the various attempts at dialogue, the summit meetings and so on, have all foundered, all failed. Because ultimately, I think that's how the Korean issue should be solved, by the two Koreas themselves, not by outsiders, even if outsiders do provide guarantees. But I'm sure many of you will disagree with me and argue that the South Korean situation is faced by a real threat from North Korea. I think it is possible, but a war on the peninsula would be terrible for both sides, as it was in 1950. It would be different sort of terrible, but it would still be terrible. And I think, in fact, that is understood. Which, in a sense, I suppose, comes on to unification. But let's see if there's any points about what I've just said.
I haven't received any questions yet. So while we give some time for the participants to leave their questions on the chat box, shall we move on to the last but the least, not the least, topic, which is toward the unification?
Yeah. In Dr. Chang, in his introduction, said Korea was the last divided nation. Oh, no, it's not. I have an Irish passport. Northern Ireland and the Republic. Well, Ireland is divided. It was very useful, actually, being of Irish origin in Pyongyang, because when they start going on about imperialists, and the British imperialists and the American imperialists, I'd say, well, I'm not British, I'm Irish, which always amused them, to put it no higher. And I would say, I had two uncles who fought the British between 1919 and 1921. which I think took wind out of sails for some of them, that this was an unexpected development. There are quite a lot of Irish in the British diplomatic service, but unification. It's true that each side has always said we want unification, but since 1953, I don't think either side has really worked towards creating the right atmosphere for unification. Yes, each side puts up proposals. Each side puts up proposals, but they are the sort of proposals that are bound to be knocked down by the other side. Just to take a few examples, the new president of South Korea, of the ROK, has made the sort of offer that was made by President Lee Myung-bak. Basically, let us come in and help you, and we'll bring you, we'll help you, we'll give you a good salary, and and that way we can work slowly towards unification. It does half sound like we want to get our hands on minerals in the north. We want to be in North Korea. We want to build roads. Hyundai built some beautiful roads up in the northeast when there was the agreed framework arrangement to build nuclear power stations there. The best roads in the whole of North Korea, I tell you. So Hyundai had very strong ambitions to get involved with North Korea. But until really both sides accept that they are very far apart in terms of direct knowledge, in terms of policies, and in terms of peoples, where there's nobody hardly alive now who remembers the United Korea. If they do, they're very, very old indeed. It wasn't always, when I was in Seoul, I mean, there were still people who spoke Japanese. They had been teenagers at the time of the Japanese, but I don't suppose there are many now who speak Japanese. And yet, if you think about it, 1945 was the last time that Korea was unified. The attempt in 1950 by the North nearly succeeded. And the attempt then by the South and the UN forces seemed on the point of succeeding, but both failed. But the legacy of a conflict is very hard to overcome. People say, oh, but Germany unified. Germany didn't fight a civil war, because although the Korean War is more than a civil war, it was essentially, in origin, a civil war. And that is very hard to repair. Look at the divisions in the United States. The divisions between the old Confederacy, the South, and the divisions between the North. The example I said about Ireland. Ireland is divided by not just 100 years of division, but several hundred years of division. There, the divide is much more based on the incomers, the plantations of Protestants into what had been an essentially Catholic country, which is now largely concentrated in the north, but wasn't always. Unification requires each side to accept that the other exists and then to start working towards bringing them together. I don't think it's easy, but you have to stop assuming that one Korea is the Korea. The very fact that people tend to talk about North Korea and Korea is, I think, in itself a division, a divisive thing. I hope that the factors that push Korea towards unification could be strengthened. You do actually share a lot. Geography. Sorry, a message flashed up. You share a history. You share a common language. Although people say, oh, North Koreans speak a different language from us in the South. To be perfectly honest, I've never heard of, in any serious discussion, that they had any problem understanding each other. There are obviously some differences. You use different terms for toilet, for example. There are other terms as well. There are different terms, but basically, you speak the same language. You read the same language. So those are positive factors. History, the fact that you are all Koreans. You behave very much in the same sort of way. When I first went to North Korea, and you found yourself involved in singing matches and drinking matches, you thought, my God, I'm back in Seoul. There are very strong Korean characteristics that are shared throughout the peninsula. And the nearer you get to each other, as it were, in physical terms, even the food is the same. Now, the food differs throughout the peninsula. But go down to Seoul and you're eating similar sorts of things to what you would eat just across the line in Seoul. So I think there are factors that pull you together, but there are also factors that push you apart. Ideological differences. It's going to be very hard to reconcile the political system in the North with the political system in the South. It's perhaps not impossible, but I find it very hard to see how it could be. Now, I think that it needs a lot of patience. It needs a lot of imagination. It needs a lot of thinking, not in terms of the past, but what the future might be. It does require changes of attitude in both countries. The North has to be less aggressive in its approach. The South has to be more accepting that there are going to be difficulties. It's not going to be easy. Maybe when all those who, like me, remember the Korean War, one of my first international memories is of the Korean War, a piece on the radio describing an attack on a North Korean train. But when all those who went through the war, and that can be not just those who were adults during the war, but those who were children during the war, when they have passed from the scene, maybe it will be easier to come to some sort of agreement. I hope so. I've always said one day there will probably be Korean unification, but probably only after I'm dead. Now, unfortunately, as the years go by, I'm 79, that deadline is coming closer and closer. So, watch me depart, and then maybe, given that the generation I am is one that just about remembers the Korean War, the generations after that will be in a stronger position. But it does require each side to be, if it's putting up proposals, to be realistic in what the other side can and cannot accept. In North Korea, they would talk about, oh, all people in South Korea want unification. They long to be under the rule, under the guidance of Kim Jong-il, who was then the leader. And you had to say to them, well, I don't think so. Something they didn't like to hear. So Korean unification, I think, one day, yes, probably. But just because places have been united once doesn't mean to say they will be united again. As I think Mr. Putin may be finding out in the Ukraine, that after all, you know, if you think about how Ukraine and Russia, the original Russian state is Kiev Rus. That's how it began, around here, and spread outwards. But that doesn't mean to say that Ukraine and Russia are now one country, despite what Mr. Putin appears to believe. Well, there should be time for other questions, and I've not covered lots of things, I know. So if you have questions that don't relate to things I've said, I'm quite willing to try and answer them.
We have quite a lot of questions in line, so
Good.
we will start with, first of all, thank you for your lecture. I think you share your stories, give us different ways to see the situations and also perspectives on the differences and similarities between the past and present, and between the North and South Korea too. So I will ask 신은주 from 영국협의회 to share your question. And after this, if 이윤정 from 영국협의회 can continue your question after addressing this question, that'd be wonderful. 신은주 교수님.
Okay, thank you. You seem very sure that the North Korea is not that much threat to the world. I mean, not as much as the other people or most countries say officially. But I do agree with you. But I think some people are really thinking that way, or some people, you know, they don't think that the North Korea is a huge threat, but they're just using that frame to benefit themselves or their country's situation, or their party's situation. So how would you approach these two types of people to change their perception?
My chances of changing the perception of these people is very limited. I suppose I should make the point that a lot of what I've said is not necessarily just something that's come off the top of my head. I mean, I've been thinking about some of this for many years. I've talked to other people. I think it's probably a good thing, for example, that the United States has withdrawn from the armistice line, and it's now Koreans who man that line. I'm not sure it's necessarily likely to lead to less clashes, but it is a sign that this is a Korean issue that has to be solved. And the problem can be that the US approach is different. And you do sometimes have to wonder about it, or I do anyway. I think that Bill Clinton began to see that there was another way of approaching the Korean issue than the traditional one of hostility. But you know, the armistice, again, it survived even things like the Pueblo and the axe murders at Panmunjom, which, if you think of it, were really quite serious incidents, particularly the Pueblo. But that said, I remember taking the chief political officer of the Foreign Office up to Panmunjom in about 1983. We went into the American briefing and all the rest of it. And when we came away, he turned to me and he said, "We've just left fairyland, haven't we?" Because he said, this is sort of highly exaggerated stuff. That the idea that somehow North Korea, remember then without nuclear weapons, can threaten the United States is nonsense. And I think it still is. North Korea may have a number of nuclear warheads. How many? Nobody really knows. Probably the highest figure I've ever seen is 60. Okay, or maybe somebody has a different figure, and nobody really knows. How many does the United States have? What if the North Koreans did attack the United States with a nuclear weapon? What would happen to North Korea? Well, you know as well as I do, that would be the end of the North Korean state. And the other factor about North Korea that I think one has to remember always is that its main concern is the survival of the elite. Sorry, I'm going back a bit now, but so they know what happened to the elites in parts of Eastern Europe. They know about Ceausescu. When Saddam Hussein was killed, I was in North Korea at the time. No mention of it whatsoever on the North Korean media, in the North Korean media. But as we were walking around Wonsan, one of the guides with us sort of took me aside and said, "Is it true that Saddam Hussein has been killed?" I said, "Yes, it is." I mean, they'd heard North Korea is full of rumors based on information that filters out. There are probably a few people who can access the internet. If you're close to an embassy, you can possibly tap into at least some signals. When I was there, certain ambassadors, the Egyptian was one, installed televisions with international programs coming in the area used by his interpreters, so that they would know what was going on in the outside world. So information not just goes to the senior elite, but goes to others as well. So they know what's happened in many of these cases. So they're looking for protection for themselves. Now, unless you can provide something like that, then you will always have a hostile North Korea, I suspect. I was shocked once at a party in Seoul. It's about 97 when I was there. I was there for 4 months at that time. Talking to a television frontman, announcer, I think, who was also a Roman Catholic, who was going on about, we've got to get there, we've got to get in there, we've got to hang them from the lampposts, this sort of approach. Now, as soon as you say that sort of thing, then you can bet your bottom dollar that unification is not going to go anywhere on the cards. So somehow, despite the war, despite the atrocities, the attacks since, if you want unification, you're going to have to accept that you may have to put aside thoughts of revenge if you want a unified country.
I think the next question is quite related to this. Yoon Jong from Yeongguk Hyobie, could you share your question with us, please?
Hi, yeah. Thank you for your sharing, and it's really helpful. And yeah, and I have got a question. So UN and many Western countries who already had their nuclear weapon strongly restrict all forms of support for North Korea. Then they described that the North Korean government cut off all available the available ways, the available support to get any to support their people, including the children and women. So I think, do you think it is fair to restrict initial support, such as food and medical support, yeah, to the people? Yeah, it's we usually in academy, when we describe something, don't mix up. So this is the attendance is attendance, and student result is result. So we do think separately, but the world society just mixed it, and then use this food and medical support as a kind of and the children's life, so like a kidnapped. So, and they use this one as their method. So how do you think about this? What do you think about this?
Well, I think sanctions are a very blunt weapon, a very unsophisticated weapon. North Korea has been under sanctions of one sort or another since 1950. Some of the ones that the United States introduced during the Korean War are still there. So that's worked very well. North Korea has really modified its policies because of sanctions. In theory, sanctions are not supposed to hit the vulnerable, the people who can't do anything about the system. In practice, they do, because countries are reluctant, and organizations are reluctant to operate in a place where they can't get funding. As I understand it, before COVID struck, the aid agencies were unable to purchase goods for North Korea because of sanctions. You could buy some things. You could buy, you know, these vinyl tents where you grow vegetables and things, which have transformed the nutrition of many children, particularly in North Korea, but also adults as well. And many organizations were putting these in place. But sanctions allow you to bring in the vinyl, but not the metal supports that are needed. So it doesn't happen. No, although sanctions are not supposed to hit the vulnerable, in practice, if they go on long enough, they do. One of the few examples of sanctions I know of working in a way was South Africa, where being cut off from international sporting events in a country that is sports mad did actually help to end the apartheid system in a very sort of long-term way. But generally, I think sanctions are very heavy-handed, and they're like a blunderbuss. They spread shot everywhere. So they hit those who are innocent as well as those who might be guilty. And basically, I don't think the sanctions really affect the senior people in North Korea. You know, even with COVID, there are still contacts with China, and people were traveling to China. And they bring in stuff for the elite. But I don't think the elite is kept going because it gets certain privileges. I think much more important than having a bottle of brandy or even a fast car is that you survive. And so the elite keeps going because the alternative is being taken over by a South that, for the present at least, they don't trust. So those, I agree. I think sanctions they've gone on for so long and they haven't actually achieved what they're supposed to. On the whole question of discrimination over nuclear matters, I mean, it's strange. When I've raised with the North Koreans in London the question of why have you got nuclear weapons, they turn around and say, well, why have you got nuclear weapons? And there's no answer to that. If we need them, why don't they need them? I personally dislike nuclear weapons intentionally. I think they're one of those things that one wishes had never been invented. But they're there, and they are in the hands of much more than the countries that are supposed to be the guardians of nuclear matters. India and Pakistan have nuclear facilities, shall we say. Israel probably does. South Africa did. The regime has never actually worked as it was supposed to. The non-proliferation regime.
Speaking of nuclear weapons, I think we can move on to the next question from Han Chung-il, 영국협의회, and then we will move on to Nam Sang-keun-님 from Ireland 협의회. Han Chung-il 선생님?
Yeah, it's not directly related to nuclear weapons, but probably there are some connections in this question that I have. So I think, Dr. Hoare, you mentioned briefly in your talk that there's such an attitude in South Korean government which may make North Koreans feel uncomfortable. And that's the question of pride, I think. North Koreans take great pride in their country. Despite their material weakness, they have a great sense of pride to their system and the society. And I think it's a very important element, which is often neglected by those who try to help North Korea. When it comes to aid provisions, there's a sense of, I hate to use this term, but I think in South Korean society, there's a sense of condescension, saying that, oh, we're better off, so we're willing to help you. But even with that kind of offers, North Korea constantly rejects that kind of help from South Korea and rather receive Chinese support. So do you think, is there any way that South Koreans can engage with North Koreans without hurting North Koreans' pride or feelings?
It's very difficult. I agree with you about the term condescension. It's they are very proud. It's sometimes very hard to see why that pride still exists, given that I mean, the country once was different. North Korea itself, and between the late 1950s and the 1970s, it was in many ways more advanced than South Korea. It was aided, assisted, of course, with massive amounts of aid, but then so was South Korea. I think the problem is that internationally, South Korea has been seen as Korea. So South Korean government thinks of itself as the Korea, and the North is not the Korea. It's a sort of breakaway area. And you just got to accept that you have to treat each other as equals. Now, there are obvious differences. Economically, the South is much poorer than the North. In terms of people, it's much smaller than the South. But it has all the pride of Koreans, and it's been well known that Koreans are a very proud people. It's a question, I suppose, of people just accepting that there is another Korea that has to be somehow accommodated. As I say, I think eventually that might be easier as generations change, but education on both sides is not helpful, I think, in this way. And it's got better in South Korea than it used to be. When I was there, you just learned that North Korea was a place full of devils with horns and things. You didn't see pictures of North Korean leaders. And in the North, it's the same. The educational system is geared to maintaining us as a separate, as the real Korea. Each projects itself as the real Korea. I think Kim Dae-jung and Roh Moo-hyun were right. I think Moon Jae-in was right to try and get away from previous attitudes. I could see that for many Koreans, South Koreans, it is difficult. If you've lost family or your family came originally from the North, it's all very well an outsider saying, oh, well, you've got to just accept that they're very proud and that you have to accommodate them. That's not easy to do, but it can be done. It has happened in certain places. But it does take an awful long time, even if you unify. As I say about Germany, you go to Germany, you can soon see where the division line was between East and West in terms of attitudes and behavior and so on. Go to the United States, the Mason-Dixon line still operates. And you know, in Europe too, places that were once Austria and Hungary were one empire once. Well, you're never going to see that again. It's Ireland was always united until 1922. Spain is beginning to sort of come together in a way that, but that's taken many years to do. These are all places that fought civil wars. No, I'm not pretending it's easy, but I think you've got to accept that it's, if you don't want conflict, then you've got to somehow come to accommodation. And that means accepting that the other is there. You said back in the 70s how you had this competition that went on between the two countries for diplomatic recognition, and after a bit they stopped doing that. But I remember that even when I was in Seoul, that if a country switched or established relations with the North, South Korea immediately recalled its ambassador, and he lost his job because he hadn't defended the country's honor. That's obviously stopped a long time ago. So I'm with you about the condescension. I don't know what the solution is. If I did, I'd be a rich man, perhaps. But I mean, some of the ideas I've got came from talking to a scholar, Soo Dae-sok, who wrote a biography of Kim Il-sung, but also touched upon this at conferences and things. And I think in one paper he wrote, touched on this business of accepting that the other side exists. However hard it is, accepting you're going to have to accommodate some of the other side's views and things.
Thank
Sorry,
you.
that's rambling a bit. But...
Yeah, it's a difficult question though. We will move on to Nam Sang-geun Nim's question, and then after this, we will invite Song Park from Seattle, United States, to share his question. So back to Nam Sang-geun Nim, please.
Hi, Dr. Hoare, thank you. I'm glad you mentioned the Irish situation, because I'm the only one who's staying from Ireland at the moment. So I asked this question to another previous the Ambassador Eamon Mekki, who used to both work in North Korea and South Korea at the same time. So what are the lessons learned you can probably apply from Good Friday Agreement to Korean situation at the moment, to start with, if you will?
Hiya.
Yeah.
Given the problems with the Good Friday Agreement at the moment.
Yeah, I know it's still going on, and it's not perfect at all.
I think the Good Friday Agreement was amazing in its way, but here you had something that would have seemed impossible 20 years previously. But Ireland was, if not politically united, it was economically united. There was free movement. You could drive across the border. You didn't know people didn't know where the border was anymore, whereas previously it had been an armed border, as you know. The younger brother of Charles Pole, Jonathan Pole, has worked as he was a diplomat, and then he left, and he worked towards reconciling the two parts of Ireland, and he's done some work on North-South relations. He's been to Pyongyang a couple of times, and I think he did think there were some things that could be gleaned from it. But of course, each country's situation is different, and it's. I think in the case of Ireland, the ultimate outcome will be demographic, probably. If the Catholics in the north grow as they are at the moment, eventually the Northern Ireland community will be much more Catholic than it is Protestant. And it's strange, really, in some ways, to be using such terms, but that's how people think of themselves. I mean, there's a Protestant tradition and a Catholic tradition, and they aren't all exactly the same. There are. Sorry, somebody at the door. I'll just let. Excuse me.
Time's running out. Yeah. Well, he's avoiding difficult question.
Yeah. He needs some time to think about it. Give him another 10 seconds. We've got about 20 minutes left, but I will try to finish 5 minutes before so that we've got closing section ready by 5 to 2.
I'm still here. But,
Up to 4, actually.
Sorry about that. A friend of mine come by. Sorry, we were talking about the Northern Ireland situation. It's taken a long time to get to that stage. It took years and years of killing and murder before we got to that stage. My parents were from the south of Ireland. As I say, I had uncles who fought the British in 1921. At least we think that's what they did. They disappeared from Ireland after 1921, so who knows what they did. No, I think there are lessons, but in each case, you know, each country is different and has different traditions and different problems. And so you can only take so much, I believe, from one and put it across to another. I think I've always understood the Irish government would be willing to talk about these sort of things, but again, I think although there are diplomatic relations between Ireland and North Korea, they're not terribly close, and of course they're not present in Pyongyang. They send people periodically from Seoul. I always think it was a great mistake that many embassies cross-recognized from Seoul. I think that sort of reinforced the idea that somehow Seoul was the proper Korea and you could deal with the North from Seoul. It would be much better if they'd gone to China or somewhere else. And I think that was the point. That's how I ended up in North Korea, because it was the permanent undersecretary at the time thought this would be a big mistake. It wouldn't really be, there'd be no advantage in operating out of Seoul. So I'm sorry, I don't know what the answer is, but I think there is probably something in the Good Friday Agreement and the way it was negotiated, the acceptance, the saying, right, we're not going to go into some of the old crimes and old things. We're just going to draw a line under it. But that still causes problems. Whether you charge soldiers who shot down civilians during the Troubles.
Mm.
Shall we move on to the next question then?
You think I'm floundering? Yeah, I think you're right.
No, not really. It's because we've got 3 more questions and 10 minutes. So 3 questions, 10 minutes. Let's see if I can handle the time pressure. And the mic goes to Nam Sang-gun-nim from 영국협의회. And oh no, we've already done this. Song Park, sorry about this. See, under the time pressure, I become a monster too. So Song Park from Seattle is the next, and then after this, I will see. Go ahead, please.
Oh yes, thank you. Hi, this is Song Park from Seattle. And my question to you is, would you share your thought on how South Korean government has and will play in this peaceful unification effort, especially who's in the power, like between progressive and conservative, and you must have witnessed the changes over time, right? And I'm not trying to put you in the spot. What I would like to hear from you is that, is there something, there must be a lesson we should learn from the history, what we have done. Thank you.
Oh yeah, we should always learn from history. I was a historian. I was trained as a historian. We never do learn from history, unfortunately. I have always had rather more sympathy for the progressives, if you like, than I have had for the conservatives. But on the other hand, if you think about it, every South Korean president since Park Chung-hee has tried to have some sort of dialogue, some discussion, some links in with North Korea. Some have done it, I think, with more sincerity than others. I think, in fact, I have a lot of time for No Tae-woo and for his approach, which didn't work, perhaps, but at least it was a more positive one than has been previously seen. But it is difficult. I mean, given that those who are of a conservative bent will draw on perhaps a right-wing tradition about the North, for them to be over radical is perhaps not easy, except if you think that the person who established US-China relations, I know they're going through problems at the moment, but the man who did that was Nixon, who was the conservatives' conservative in some ways. Man who'd been very opposed to China. Whatever one may think about Donald Trump, and I would not like to be in the same room as the man, but that's a different thing altogether. But I think that if he hadn't got sidetracked over the nuclear issue by people like John Bolton, there was something there that could have been built on. So there's nothing stopping a conservative making a radical decision if they see advantage in doing so. So I think it is not inconceivable that if a South Korean conservative leader decided to really go for a better relationship with the North, they might be able to do it, because assuming they could carry their supporters with them. But I know South Korean politics are not really easily categorized in European terms, but basically there is a slightly less conservative and a slightly more conservative group, and very little in between. So I think that, yeah, if a conservative were to really take this on and decide to push it, that might have more success. It might also cause lots of tensions within society, but they might well be able to carry it off, for what it's worth. That's my view.
I've got another tough questions to ask. So
They're all tough questions.
It was a question from Tongum Sunim from Frankfurt, and let me read the question for you. Is UN/USA putting the most severe sanctions to North Korea because North Korea's nuclear weapons are the most threatening one in the world? If not, why the most intensive sanctions are being given to North Korea?
I think the questioner knows the answer. North Korea's weapons are, in themselves, are probably not the most threatening in the world. I think at the moment it's the Russian nuclear arsenal, which is the most, seems to be the most threatening in the world. I think the belief is that perhaps North Korea might be less careful of rules and regulations than other countries and might proliferate. But going back, you know, a number of countries have got nuclear weapons who, under the terms of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, shouldn't have them. As I said, I think some countries that do have them, like Britain and France, would be better off without them, to be honest. If you have them, you may be tempted to use them, or others may be tempted to try and stop you using them. So I'm not sure that nuclear weapons are, unless you have vast numbers of them and are prepared to risk a retaliation, are much use to you. I think also North Korea was for so long seen as a pariah state that it is still seen in some quarters in that way, even if they have moved away from the non-recognition state that was the case. So no, I don't think North Korea is the most threatening country in the world.
And here comes potentially the very last question of today from 유해덕 중동협의회님. Would you like to speak? Yes, please.
Hi, Dr. James. Thank you for this very useful lecture for our unification members. My question is, you said before, Korea had a civil war between North and South. So do you mean this is a dilemma for our Korea unification? Because unlikely Germany had no civil war, but they have become united. So do you think this is the dilemma for us to be united?
Yes, I think it is. I think civil wars have a long, as I said, a long tail to them. Even when they come to an end, that the tensions and the stresses created by a civil war. So people within one country fighting against each other. And let's accept that Korea are the same people. If that happens, then it is very difficult to bring about a complete reconciliation. Germany did not fight a civil war. Germany fought a world war. And Germany was divided by the Allies at the end of the war. Just as Korea was divided for, in theory, just to take the surrender of the forces. But that led to two states. Germany eventually also led to two states. But the fact that they had not fought a war, I think, made it easier for them to become fully united again. The United States fought a civil war, a very bloody and nasty civil war, the War of the Brothers, it's called. And as I say, that I think the divisions are still very strongly there, that the North and the South are very different in their approaches. And the South, even though the United States is perhaps a very conservative society, the South's conservatism is far more violent and extreme perhaps than the North's. But so I think, yes, a civil war is not a good basis on which to build a unified state.
But as you know, who had the experience of Korean Civil War, they are already old, and the new generation, they are just, we learned from history and movies, etc. So as you know, we have a new government set, like a conservative party. So we expect when there is a Democratic Party, we'll go further, good relationship with North Korea. We have more conversation, more cooperation, etc. But if, as you know, if Conservative Party, all this progress going backward. So before I come to your lecture, most of Korean professor who is expert to North, and they said our unification dilemma is because our political leaders are lacking of their idea and their vision and sort kind of those things, not because we have a civil war, so we have a hatred in our mind. So do you think that really affect our unification?
I think it does. I think that the fact that Koreans fought Koreans on Korean soil still goes on. The atmosphere, the attitudes that were created are passed on through education, through discussions amongst families, things like that. If your family suffered during the Korean War, it's not your generation, it's probably not the generation before you, but it still goes on. These things are passed down. You say the Korean War was a long time ago and people are young and don't remember it. The American War was even longer ago and it's still remembered.
Thank you, Jim. I think I will, or very last minute.
No. I think I've made the same point several times, so I'll stop there. Thank you for the questions.
I do thank you for all the questions today, and because we've got 3 minutes to 4, let me try to finish today's talk. So we tried to answer these 4 or talk about these 4 topics with Jim today, and we do thank you for your presence today, Jim. Thanks so much for your honest and reflectful answers. And what comes next is So we've got now that the Peace in Korea essay competition is on. So we are accepting students' essays until the, I think, end of September. So if you have any university students, you know, please share this with them, please. And before you leave, any constructive feedbacks and comments are really helpful for us to prepare for the next session. So please 떠나기 전에 유익했던 점과 개선할 점을 채팅창에 남겨주시면 참고하여 다음 강연에 준비하도록 하겠습니다. So Jim, I will give you last 1 minute to close this talk today, please.
Well, I hope that some of it's been interesting. I try to be honest. I'm sometimes accused of being pro-North Korean. I'm not pro-North Korean. I'm not pro anything except Korea, perhaps. I like North. I like the people of the North. I like the people of the South. I like knowing about your country. And I hope that at least I've provoked a few thoughts, if nothing else. You don't have to agree with me. I don't want to see the feedback, I suspect, but some of it may be positive. But anyway, thank you all very much for taking part. Thank you for the questions. Thank you for making me think, which is always a useful exercise. So I've enjoyed it. I hope you have too.
I'm sure that we enjoyed it very much as well. And thank you for having you here today, Jim.